Thank you. I want to thank AmCham for giving me the honor to address this very distinguished group today. And it's also a great honor to share the podium with Steve Roach. I don't know much about technology, but I know quite a bit about geopolitics. And I think where I can bring value to this audience is to look at the future of technology from the perspective of US-China relations. And my remarks will be separated into three parts. First, I talk a little bit about why the relationship has degenerated or deteriorated to where it is today. And second, I will focus on how future US-China strategic competition, or you call it strategic conflict, will affect technology. And lastly, I will speculate what might be the end outcome. In my interactions with business communities, both in Asia and the US, my sense is that the business community, and also that would include the technology community, has not really fully absorbed the long-term consequences of the US-China strategic conflict. This is the reality. This is not, Steve talked about the Thucydides trap, but we are already in the trap. And I'll explain why that is the case. In the last 3 years, the US had a fundamental rethink about its policy toward China. And this rethink was prompted by three sets of factors. The first, and I would say the most important, was the rapid increase of Chinese power and the rapid closing of the gap between China and the US. And as a result, the sense in Washington was that there was decreasing room for error. When the US began to engage China, when you look at 1980, I have a set of GDP numbers indicating the gap between China and the US in terms of the size of the GDP measured in dollars. When you measure national power, it's the dollar amount that really matters. 1980, China's GDP was 6% of US GDP in terms of dollars. 1990, 10 years later, was still 6%. 2000 was 12%. 2010 was 40%. 2017 was 62%. I think what happened was in the revolution in this change in the balance of power between the US and China is a relatively recent phenomenon, all about the last 15 years. And when you look at change in Chinese behavior, change in American perception of China, I think you can see a sea change in this period. And so this is the first reason. The second reason was that when the US began to engage China, it had a set of assumptions about what engagement policy would ultimately produce, how it would transform China. And if you take out a list, circa 2015, and then go down the list, again, I'm speaking from the perspective of an American strategic thinker. I think if you go down the list, probably most of it would say, assumptions proven wrong. And so that exercise, intellectual exercise or reality check, fundamentally weakened the case for continuing a policy that did not seem to be panning out. There's a very good article I hope you will have a chance to read. It's by Harry Harding, the preeminent China watcher. He wrote an article in the Washington Quarterly at the end of 2015. Has our China policy failed? The article should have been Politburo Standing Committee reading material. I don't know whether that's the case or not. But it systematically laid out it systematically reviewed American policy toward China and whether that engagement policy was producing the results expected. That, incidentally, was a time when the US was conducting a very quiet debate about China policy. And the third factor is really the fundamental change or the enormous change within U.S. society. I think that's largely because of the failure of the American system, political system, to address the adverse consequences of globalization, rising inequality, hollowing out of the middle class. And that social change produced a backlash against globalization, and of course China being the this very powerful force in globalization became a very convenient political target. So this is about why the relationship is where it is today. So how will this largely conflictual relationship? I think the opening question might be phrased. It's not both. It's both competitive and cooperative. But it's about the ratio. When you have 50-50, it's one thing. When you have 75% conflictual, 25% cooperative, it's largely a quite adversarial relationship. So if the U.S.-China relationship is indeed, has indeed moved to that of an adversarial relationship, how will this affect technology? I would say that probably this will, changes will come in two stages. We're probably at the first stage. I'll call this sector-specific restrictions. The U.S. is now rolling out policies targeting individual sectors. And these restrictions are tighter than before, but they're not as tight as some in the U.S. strategic community would like to see. The likely stage in the coming years will be what I call comprehensive restrictions. Let's not forget, the U.S., unlike China, fought a Cold War. The U.S. had a set of strategies, a set of plans it could easily dust off and take off from the shelves and implement them. I think the first one would be expansion of sensitive technologies to include many technologies that would probably have nothing to do with the national defense. The second likely outcome is the revival of COCOM. There's a Cold War organization called Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Control. In the study of Cold War, this organization was given a lot of credit for ensuring the technological edge of the Western alliance. I think the likelihood of at least a serious attempt made to revive this organization is quite real, because the U.S. Alone really cannot limit China's future technological advances. And third is that the U.S. will extend, very likely to extend those restrictions to education exchange, because unlike the Soviet Union, China and the U.S. have very deep, extensive educational exchanges, because where knowledge comes from, we all know, is from those education exchanges. So the temptation is very high to go to the source of Chinese technological advance. How will China respond to these changes? And I would say the first, let me just, before I say this, I would say, how will this affect Hong Kong? I think Hong Kong will be caught in the middle, because we're in Hong Kong. The temptation for China to evade American technological restrictions through Hong Kong will be very high. And as a result, the U.S., of course, will be motivated to shut this back door. So how will China respond to the coming competition or conflict in the technological area? I think what Steve mentioned, that trend will continue. China will dramatically increase R&D spending. the industrial policy will be reinforced. Because for China, achieving technological independence and sustaining the momentum is a matter of national survival. I think what has happened in terms of thinking in both China and the US is that over the last 40 years, the two countries worked very hard to build an interdependent economic system or to integrate each other's economy. Now, the thinking is that this kind of economic interdependence poses an unacceptable national security risk. And once this kind of thinking sets in, specific policies will simply be a matter of time. So for China, the realization, and of course, the ZTE incident was a wake-up call. And when you look at official rhetoric, we don't know what has also happened behind the scenes. But I think if I were a Chinese leader, I would say, never again. We're not going to allow our economic future to be at the mercy. But then, if you look at the U.S. said, never again. We're not going to allow a strategic competitor to gain the technology. So China's initial response, and I would say this is one China perfectly has the means to do, will be dramatically increase R&D spending and strengthen industrial policy. And I would also that another long-term impact was that the technological world will be fragmented. So today, integration of the two economies means integration of technology. But in the future, it is very likely that China will have its own technological standard. So you will have separation. And third is that China's response to the U.S. will be try to increase its effort to recruit, especially ethnic Chinese scientists from the U.S. Because I think one thing that's very likely to happen is that ethnic profiling in the U.S. Will worsen a great deal. Because a lot of ethnic Chinese Americans work in the Silicon Valley, in high-tech companies, in universities, and based on recent investigations by the U.S. FBI, these are targets. So in the future, this could be a really bad trend. And that will, of course, make it a lot easier for China to recruit, to attract these scientists back to China. So how will this conflict end? Because you think about this as U.S.-China strategic conflict end. There were really three plausible scenarios. The first one is that we have a ground bargain. I think this is we're at the initial stage of this U.S.-China strategic conflict. If you compare this to a baseball game, out of 9 innings, this is the first inning. So if U.S. and China can somehow come to a ground bargain to resolve all their fundamental issues, then we can avoid a prolonged U.S.-China strategic conflict. But this is difficult because what really lies at the stake is competing ideological beliefs, competing economic systems, and then competing geopolitical interests. So how can they come to a satisfactory conclusion? So now let's move to the second plausible scenario, is that after a period of strategic competition, both sides, especially China, feel it is better to end this thing early. I call this early resolution or early capitulation. That is, China decided to agree to a set of terms demanded by the U.S., not just economic. I think behind this, it is too partial a view to view U.S.-China relations just from an economic point of view. It will have to be a very comprehensive solution. And this might happen in the next 3 to 5 years because we really don't know the consequences of the trade war in particular. And finally, I think I call the scenario is to the bitter end. How specifically the bitter end, how bitter the bitter end will be, I'll leave it to your rich imagination. Thank you.